Donald Trump says he can end the war in Ukraine. He says it confidently, repeatedly, and always with the same implication, that the world's most brutal conflict can be resolved not through collective pressure, accountability, or deterrence, but through him. Through his personal relationships, his instincts, and most notably, through his relationship with Vladimir Putin. But when we look closely at the timing, the optics, and the consequences of Trump's recent actions, a very different story emerges. One that raises serious questions, not just about whether Trump can end the war, but about who would actually benefit if he tried. As Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy traveled to Florida for what were supposed to be critical peace discussions, Donald Trump chose that exact moment to publicly highlight a phone call with Vladimir Putin. Not behind closed doors, not quietly, but openly, strategically, and with unmistakable intent. The message was clear: I am the power broker. I speak to Putin. I decide. And that message did not land in a vacuum. At the same time, Russia escalated its rhetoric, amplified disinformation, and suddenly announced that it had foiled a drone attack on Vladimir Putin's residence, an extraordinary claim, made without evidence, and immediately echoed by Russian state media as justification for potential retaliation. Zelenskyy, meanwhile, warned that Kyiv's government buildings were under imminent threat. This is not coincidence. This is pattern. And it's a pattern we've seen before. Russia has long relied on information warfare as a strategic weapon, using fabricated threats, exaggerated attacks, and emotional narratives to shape public opinion, justify escalation, and manipulate negotiations. The sudden emergence of a dramatic claim involving an alleged attack on Putin's personal residence fits that playbook perfectly. It creates urgency. It creates fear. It creates leverage. And it creates the impression that Russia is the aggrieved party. Now place Donald Trump at the center of this moment. Instead of challenging the narrative, instead of expressing solidarity with Ukraine during a period of heightened threat, Trump's focus was on optics, on positioning himself as the indispensable intermediary between the aggressor and the victim. That matters. Because diplomacy is not just about outcomes, it's about pressure, posture, and perception. When Trump publicly emphasizes his relationship with Putin while Ukraine is under threat, it shifts the balance. It subtly reframes the conflict not as a war of aggression, but as a misunderstanding that can be resolved if only the right man is in the room. That framing benefits only one side. Zelenskyy understands this. That's why his warnings about strikes on Kyiv's government buildings were not just military alerts, they were political signals. Signals that Ukraine cannot afford diplomacy that prioritizes image over reality, or personality over principle. Because Ukraine is not negotiating from a position of comfort. It is negotiating while under attack. And here's the critical point: Russia negotiates best when it feels powerful, not pressured. Trump's approach, personalized, optics-driven, centered on his own perceived influence, risks removing pressure from Russia at the exact moment pressure is needed most. Let's be clear about what Russia wants. Russia wants legitimacy. Russia wants concessions without accountability. Russia wants Ukraine's allies divided. And Russia wants the war framed as something that can be settled, rather than something that must be confronted. Every time Trump talks about how well he gets along with Putin, every time he suggests that the war could be ended quickly if only others stepped aside, he feeds into that narrative. And the consequences are not theoretical. When negotiations are framed around personalities rather than principles, the weaker party is often pressured to compromise for peace. In this case, that weaker party is Ukraine. Trump has repeatedly hinted, sometimes directly, sometimes implicitly, that Ukraine may need to give something up. Territory, guarantees, leverage. He frames it as realism. But realism for whom? Because from Ukraine's perspective, giving something up means legitimizing invasion. It means rewarding aggression. And it means setting a precedent that borders can be changed through force, so long as the aggressor waits long enough and negotiates loudly enough. That's why Zelenskyy has been clear: peace cannot come at the cost of sovereignty. And that's why Trump's approach is so troubling. He is not positioning himself as a defender of international law or democratic norms. He is positioning himself as a dealmaker, someone who believes that conflict is a transaction, and that outcomes are measured by headlines, not long-term stability. Look again at the timing. Zelenskyy arrives in Florida. Russia announces an alleged attack on Putin. Trump publicizes his call with Putin. Russian threats escalate. Ukraine warns of imminent strikes. This is not random chaos. This is an environment where perception matters more than facts, and Trump is playing directly into that dynamic. Russia understands something Trump either ignores or underestimates, that modern warfare is as much about narrative as it is about missiles. By elevating himself as the central negotiator, Trump unintentionally sidelines institutions, alliances, and collective pressure, the very mechanisms that have constrained Russia's ambitions so far. And make no mistake, Russia prefers bilateral deals over multilateral resistance. Always has. One-on-one negotiations favor the stronger party, especially when that party is willing to threaten escalation, fabricate grievances, and exploit the other side's desire for a quick win. This is why Ukraine has consistently pushed for international frameworks, security guarantees, and long-term commitments, not vague promises or personality-driven assurances. Because Ukraine knows that Russia signs deals it intends to break. So when Trump suggests he can end the war quickly, the real question becomes, on whose terms? History gives us clues. We've seen what happens when authoritarian leaders are rewarded for aggression. We've seen what happens when democratic allies are pressured to compromise for the sake of peace. And we've seen what happens when optics replace accountability. The result is not stability. It's delay. It's escalation. And eventually, it's more violence. Trump's defenders argue that talking to Putin is pragmatic. That dialogue is necessary. And that may be true in principle. But diplomacy without leverage is not diplomacy, it's concession. And Trump has shown little interest in applying leverage to Russia. Instead, he applies pressure where it's easiest, on Ukraine. That's why Zelensky's warnings matter. That's why Russia's disinformation campaigns matter. And that's why the optics of this moment matter so deeply. Because this is not just about ending a war. It's about how wars end. Do they end because aggressors are deterred and held accountable? Or do they end because victims are exhausted and pressured into submission? Donald Trump's approach suggests the latter. And that should concern anyone who believes that peace must be built on justice, not convenience. As Russia continues to escalate threats and manipulate narratives, Ukraine remains under existential threat. Kyiv's government buildings are not symbolic targets, they are the heart of a sovereign state fighting for survival. In that context, performative diplomacy is not harmless. It is dangerous, because when leaders prioritize their own image as dealmakers over the lived reality of war, the cost is paid in lives, not press releases. Trump may believe he can end the war in Ukraine. But if ending the war means legitimizing aggression, sidelining accountability, and pressuring the invaded rather than the invader, then the world should be very clear about what kind of peace is being offered. And who it truly serves. This moment is not about Donald Trump. It's not about Vladimir Putin. And it's not even about optics. It's about whether the international community allows power, personality, and propaganda to rewrite the rules, or whether it stands firm against the idea that wars can be ended by rewarding those who start them. Because if this war ends the wrong way, it will not be the last. And that is the story behind the headlines. Not a promise of peace. But a warning.